welcome to another episode of the Exceptional Leadership Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Matt Hamilton, delighted to have your company with me for a discussion today on the concept of taking advantage and seizing opportunity as leaders in times of chaos. Now, this is something that we can observe leaders doing throughout history. It is also something that I have done myself, specifically during COVID, and we'll get into that, and I'll tell you about what I did in the body of the podcast. But I guess just a few headline thoughts that I want to float with you guys before we get into our real-world example from history to illustrate the point. What I want to illustrate is the concept that during times of chaos, that is actually when good leadership is needed the most, because people are frightened, the future is uncertain, so on and so forth. But what it also represents for leadership is a great opportunity to implement initiatives that perhaps would be more difficult to implement in calmer times. Now, the reality, the flip side, is that this can present opportunities for good, and it can represent opportunities for evil, so to speak, and to simplify it to, the two sort of generic light and dark sides. So we need to be aware of both sides of the coin. But given we are all ethical, compassionate, good leaders, I trust that you will use this information for its intended purposes, which is to implement only good initiatives. But of course, we don't want to be naive, we don't want to be ignorant, we need to understand both sides of the coin, and we'll explore that a little bit further into the episode. But first, as we always do, let's set the scene with an example from history and learn about how an American president utilized a chaotic situation to implement sweeping change across society. Here we go. In the darkest days of the Great Depression, as breadlines stretched around city blocks and banks closed their doors for good, the United States teetered on the edge of collapse. It was 1933 and Americans had lost faith in their institutions. Unemployment had soared past 20%, savings had vanished overnight, and despair hung in the air like a thick smoke. Into this chaotic situation stepped Franklin D. Roosevelt, a man whose calm voice and unshakable optimism would soon echo through millions of radios across the country. In his inaugural address, he famously told the American people that, and I quote, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," end quote. But he didn't just speak to soothe the nation, he acted as well. So, within hours of taking office, Roosevelt declared a national bank holiday, closing all banks to prevent further collapse. And in his first 100 days, he pushed Congress to pass an unprecedented wave of legislation, what came to be known as the New Deal. These were bold, sometimes controversial programs that expanded the role of the federal government in ways previously unthinkable. He launched massive public works initiatives, putting millions of unemployed Americans back to work, building roads, bridges, and schools. He introduced the Social Security Act, ensuring that the elderly and the vulnerable would no longer be left to fend for themselves. Through new laws, he regulated Wall Street and the banking system, restoring confidence in the financial sector. Roosevelt didn't waste the crisis. Instead, he used it. In the midst of national despair, he reshaped the government relationship with the American people, and he laid the groundwork for a more just and secure society. What began as an economic catastrophe became instead the catalyst for one of the most transformative eras in US history, led by a president who saw opportunity in adversity and acted with vision and resolve. And that is, I think, a very nice example of how someone took advantage of a chaotic situation to implement positive change and positive reform. But we don't need to restrict our analysis to the political sphere and the international stage to find really good examples of where similar things have occurred. As I said, I have a personal example of where I was able to implement some really positive change in a chaotic environment. We'll get into that a little bit later, and I'm sure you guys can probably think off the top of your heads situations that you've encountered where you have also seen similar things occur. I suppose the important thing to note, in the spirit of not being naive, is that these situations can also elicit opportunities for evil to fill the void, and we need to be very cognizant of that. We'll get into that in future. So, in terms of my initial thoughts on this, so chaos and uncertain times, they can be unsettling, but they can also create fertile ground for changes that would otherwise, as I said, have proved difficult to implement in times gone by. And this situation is something that can be used, as I also said, for both good and evil purposes. You don't have to go too far back in history to think of situations that illustrate both, or examples that illustrate both. So we as ethical and kind, courageous leaders must understand how this dynamic works in times of chaos so that we can successfully identify when ill intent regarding change is present. So let's delve into that a little bit more. So we just gave the example of the Franklin D. Roosevelt situation. Now, I think we'd agree that, social security is a good thing. Looking after the elderly and the vulnerable is a positive change. And it looks like Franklin D. Roosevelt identified that situation and took the opportunity to implement good change. On the flip side of the coin, if you go back to the late 1930s, Adolf Hitler also successfully, from his perspective, took advantage of economic and political turmoil to rise to power, essentially. And we all know how that went. And you don't have to delve too far, into the records to identify this pretty quickly. The social climate and the political climate, economic climate in Germany at the time when Adolf Hitler rose to power, it was absolutely chaotic. People were struggling, the country was not in a good way, and that unfortunately laid the foundation for Adolf Hitler to come to power, leveraging the discontent of the German people, and unfortunately, carry out some of the biggest atrocities that we've ever seen. That is where it stemmed from. So we need to be aware as leaders that, being naive gets us nowhere. We need to be able to identify when bad actors are looking to implement negative change, but we also need to be brave and alert to the opportunities before us to implement positive change. So let's get to my example from COVID-19, probably a time that I'd rather forget, to be honest with you, but it was 2020, and to set the scene for you, I was an operations manager for a great big facilities management company, and we looked after about 52,000 individual assets within a big hospital, 800-bed hospital, 5,000 employees on site, so great big community, great big workplace. And for a long time, for reasons unbeknown to me, I inherited a team that was based in what could only be described as a basement. Okay, it was completely unfit from a workplace perspective. We didn't have a nice carpeted office with windows and nice ergonomically appropriate desks and seating available for our staff. Instead, what we actually had was a storeroom in a basement with no natural light whatsoever, surrounded by corridors, essentially underground, in an underground setting, fluorescent lighting, and no natural airflow whatsoever. And the space that we were located in was actually a storeroom. So we would have racking and spare parts all around the perimeter of the room, and then we had desks set up in the middle of that space. And at the time, we had sometimes upwards of 4 or 5 people working in a space that was probably no bigger than 5 meters by 6 meters, something like that. Very cramped, very unpleasant work environment. And for whatever reason, senior management at the time had never seen any need to provide the team with a more appropriate working environment. It was sort of a case of out of sight, out of mind. And the irony was that the vast majority of the workforce of this company that I worked for on the same site, they were located in a beautiful, well-appointed admin building, which did have all of the natural light, carpeted floors, well-ventilated spaces, nicely spaced out work, stations, so on and so forth. So a bit perplexing as to how that team was ignored for that long. But shortly after I was appointed to that leadership position, chaos ensued when COVID reared its ugly head. And of course, you'll remember at that time, there was all this talk about social distancing, mask wearing, making sure that we had well-ventilated working environments to prevent the spread of what is a respiratory illness. And it seemed to me, with all the focus on social distancing and containing the spread of this virus, it seemed to me that there would never be a better time to seize the initiative and relocate ourselves to a more appropriate workspace than the one that the opportunity was in front of me at the time. Absolutely no better time would ever come across my desk again than that opportunity that was presented to me. And so what I did was I adopted the better to ask for forgiveness than permission approach. We had another unused room that we had identified as being far more appropriate. It did have natural light, it did have carpet on the floor, it did have higher ceilings, but at that time it was being used as a storeroom. So ironically, the more appropriate office space with carpet on the floors was being used as a storeroom, and the storeroom was being used as office space by us and my team. So it just made no sense at all. And so what I did was I proactively ran this suggestion by a few of my more senior managers at the time. I highlighted and focused on the safety concerns associated with staying in our current location versus moving to the more appropriate new location. And we arrived at a consensus that the time was right to simply make the move. And so we did. I mobilized the team on the day and we moved all of that storage equipment out of the new office space and swapped it. Our desks went into that location, that storage equipment went into the location that we were originally seated at. And we ended up with a far more appropriate and well-appointed office space and a safer working environment for the team, simply because I identified an opportunity to perform the move without real permission and take the initiative. And the reason I was able to get away with that and avoid the traditional bureaucratic hurdles that would have been roadblocks to me in trying to execute that change. The reason I was able to do that is because we lived in a chaotic time where the rules-based order was flipped on its head. The priority was safety. People were far more concerned with COVID and how to manage that and the impact on a societal level than they were about where we sat. And I knew that. I knew that the bureaucracy that would have potentially opposed our move for political reasons, I knew that they would be focused elsewhere. And so I made a bit of a captain's call, and as far as I know, the team still sits in that space years and years after I've departed from that organisation. So that is an example of lasting positive change that I was able to implement thanks to the chaos that was brought to us by COVID. And it was a positive change. And I think the thing I want to focus on here is that sometimes as a leader, even though the times may be unsettling and a little nerve-wracking for yourself, you have to be able to pull the trigger. And that's why I mentioned asking for forgiveness rather than permission. Sometimes that's what you have to do. You have to do a risk-based cost-benefit analysis, and you have to work out when you need to be courageous and when the risk is worth the reward. And I knew that there would be a little bit of flack I would cop because I didn't ask the bureaucratic powers that be at the time for permission. To fill you guys in and give you some context, in a hospital environment like that, where a private organisation is employed to manage the facility, but the facility is owned by the state government, there is a lot of politics at play around the allocation of space. So that's why it was potentially a bit of a political minefield. So even if the opportunity presents itself, you still have to have the courage as a leader to pull the trigger. The reason it's important to ensure that you are ready for this chaotic event to implement your positive change is because if you fail to do so, it is highly likely that somebody with ill intent will seize the opportunity. And we know what happens in the event of a leadership vacuum. To take it on, to a geopolitical sort of level, we see it all the time with regimes that are being overthrown in Middle Eastern countries, for example. Think Syria, think Libya back in the day, right? You have a government which is, sure, evil and not particularly nice. They're overthrown, and then there's this big leadership vacuum, and oftentimes something that is far worse than what was there originally comes in and takes that place. That's an example of evil taking advantage of chaotic situations. It unfortunately goes both ways. So as leaders, we need to be compassionate, kind, good people, but we can't be too nice. There's a difference between being nice and being good. And the difference is that you can be good, right? You can operate according to moral principles, solid, firm moral principles for the greater good, but still understand how to proactively move and take advantage without asking for permission. Okay, that's the difference between being good and being nice. The nice guy or the nice girl is often too nice. They don't know how to assert themselves. They don't know how to move proactively because they're always seeking permission. They're afraid to make the call. So I don't want you guys to be nice. I want you to be good. There is a difference. All right. I want you to utilize what I like to call positive aggression. Okay. Aggression is often cast in a very negative light, and that is understandable because there are negative forms of aggression, but sometimes you need to be positively aggressive. And all I mean by that is you need to have the ability to not be too nice and seize the moment. Not ask for permission, not be too nice, be courageous, but base your actions on firm, well-founded moral principles that are aimed at a greater good. I hope that makes sense. We got a little bit philosophical there, didn't we? But I think it's valuable. So, the space example is my personal example. I said forgiveness versus permission. Sometimes it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. So courage is required. And then in closing, theme that I touched on is the idea that we've all heard, which is that power needs to be seized because it's not given. And unless we're willing to, and I use power as a broad term there, power probably could think of a better phrasing of it, I suppose, but I suppose let's substitute power for opportunity. Opportunity must be seized because no one's going to implement it for you. Same concept though. You have to be willing to take it. So in closing, we've seen how these opportunities present opportunities for both good and evil. Hitler being a great example, Franklin D. Roosevelt being a good example for the positive side of things. So let's make sure that when the opportunity presents itself, we as good, courageous leaders are there and ready to pull the trigger. Because good leadership takes courage. Let's learn to be comfortable in chaos, even thrive in chaos, because it's when good leaders are needed the most. And I must admit, I experienced a really weird kind of phenomenon. I actually quite like operating in chaos. And I think it's because I know that there are very few who do it well. And I don't think the bar is all that high in terms of standards. I don't think many people operate well in chaos from a leadership perspective. And so I naturally see it as an opportunity, because I know that if I can keep my head, and if I can be what others are not, I and my team are going to get really beneficial outcomes. And I know that on a personal greater good level, if I can do what most others aren't doing, if I can bring sanity and calm and peace to a frightening situation where everybody else is losing their heads, then I'm going to be viewed in a really positive light. And I think for that reason, I don't mind operating in chaos. I see it as an opportunity to remove unnecessary roadblocks or bypass unnecessary roadblocks and implement things that are held up unnecessarily when the status quo is in place. Interesting personal observation. You don't know how you're going to react until you go through it. What I have learned is that I am comfortable. And I think that's a really positive thing to be aware of as a leader. And I hope you guys, if you're not currently comfortable, can learn to be comfortable in chaotic environments in future once you have mused upon these things that we've discussed in this podcast. Because as I said, in times of chaos, that is when good leadership is needed the most. So guys, we'll leave it there. I'm trying really hard to keep these podcasts under 20 minutes, but it's a little bit difficult when we start getting into these sort of deeper questions. Nevertheless, I enjoy it a lot, and I hope you're getting value from it too. As I always do, I'm going to ask that you subscribe to this show on whatever podcast app you consume the content on. Follow us on Instagram, so on and so forth, and join the group, the Community of Practice group on LinkedIn. And if you're getting value from the show and you've subscribed, I'm going to ask you to do me another favor, and that is share this podcast on your socials. Share this podcast around your network, because there are a lot of people out there who I think are looking for a bit of direction and a little bit of help with respect to leadership and their own leadership journey. And if you think they would value and benefit from this podcast, I'd really appreciate it if you would send it their way, and you would help me to spread the word and grow the audience a little more. I need your help to do that, and I would be eternally grateful if you'd help me out with that. I always say that leadership is something that affects absolutely everybody. You don't have to be leading people yourself to benefit from a greater in-depth knowledge of leadership, because ultimately we are all led by someone. So you need to know what good looks like, regardless of whether you are in the leadership position or if you are under a leader. So hit subscribe, guys, share the podcast, tell a friend, tell 10 friends, continue enjoying the show. And again, thank you so much for joining me. So until next time, I'll say goodbye.